Just a very brief note before this video begins, which is on the work of Phil Fischer and his presentation on POTS from the POTS UK conference I was at last week. That is simply to say that he is Dr. Phil Fischer, not Professor Phil Fischer, as I call him in the video. So I'm very sorry I made that error, and I ask your forgiveness for it. Please just bear in mind that when you're watching it, I made a mistake and didn't realise it until I'd finished making the video itself.
Hello, my name is Patrick Usher, and in this video I wish to discuss some further reflections on the conference I attended on September the 8th, 2017, the POTS UK Conference Masterclass for Healthcare Professionals in London. And in this talk I wish to focus in detail on another presentation from the day, which was the keynote presentation by Professor Phil Fischer from the Mayo Clinic in America. And Professor Fischer already has a YouTube presence. You can find him if you look up POTS syndrome Mayo Clinic on YouTube. You will see that he has a short video there where he talks about what POTS is and what its symptoms are and so on and so forth, and it has a huge number of hits, something like 180,000 the last time I checked. And he has a lovely manner as a medical professional. He really comes across very well. He's the kind of person you'd want to be your consultant if you had to have one. Professor Phil Fischer has a lovely manner and way of approaching people. And it was very nice to meet him at the conference. And before I proceed any further, I just wish to add in a caveat here that, of course, my reflections on Professor Fischer's paper are given secondhand. You know, I was there, I saw it, but and I'm trying to convey what I saw as best as I can. I'm aware that there may be some errors. I try to distinguish in my talk where I'm discussing my own views and where I'm presenting Professor Fischer's, and yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. This is just a caveat, and as I mentioned in the other video, from as far as I'm aware, all of these talks were filmed. They will be on the POTS UK website at some point, so you can go and check out the original talks for yourselves. Now, he specialises in POTS vis-a-vis adolescents and children, but mainly adolescents, because they tend to be adolescents who get it. They're not always. Sometimes children can get it as well. And so Professor Fischer's talk, as you'll see here in the first slide, was entitled Adolescent POTS North American Pediatric Guidelines. There you see there Professor Phil Fischer, General Pediatric and Adolescent Medicine from the Mayo Clinic. So, the first point that was interesting that Professor Fischer made, as you can see from this slide here, is the prevalence of POTS. Now, this is important because, you know, as I said in the last video as well, the kind of figure of 500,000 people with POTS as a minimum in America and 3 million as a maximum, that's sort of chucked around a lot. But there's actually been no sort of studies into the prevalence of POTS, you know, per 100,000 in the population or whatever. No epidemiological studies have been done. And this was a recurring theme at the conference, was the need for epidemiological studies to identify how prevalent POTS really is. So a lot of it's kind of guesswork at the moment. But what Professor Fischer was pointing out is that from studies with chronic fatigue, where about half to 2/3 of patients also have abnormal autonomic function, then if 2% of teenagers have debilitating chronic fatigue, then maybe half to 2/3 of them have POTS. So maybe POTS is, maybe 1% of American teenagers have POTS. Maybe, he said. You know, it's a real big question mark. One doesn't know the prevalence, in truth. But interesting in that slide, though, to see also that half to 2/3 of patients with chronic fatigue have also abnormal autonomic function, which is really supportive of the idea that chronic fatigue syndrome and POTS syndrome have overlaps and that they are both, I would suggest, autonomic nervous system dysfunction, both limbic system impairments. It may be that certain parts of the limbic system are more affected than others in these conditions, but nevertheless, that kind of statistic does point to an overlap. Now, the next slide I wanted to look at from Professor Fischer's talk was the comorbidities slide, which was interesting. So in this one, you see that he pointed out that a lot of times POTS patients are also hypermobile. A lot of them have iron deficiency. That's something new to consider. A lot of them are low in vitamin D. And then there's mast cell activation disorder, which he actually put at less than 5%. I've tended to emphasize that more. I think it's possibly more prevalent than that, but that's been his clinical experience. So I'm prepared to accept that figure, but it is certainly a factor. And less commonly seen ADHD, and as he put it, also seen in the POTS patient is almost anything else. And that's true. There's so many different symptoms, so many different pathologies that can coexist with POTS, or indeed be knock-on effects, i.e. secondary effects of having a limbic system in crisis. And from my point of view, I think it's quite possible that iron deficiency could be explained as a knock-on effect or secondary effect of limbic system impairment, because your body is not able to absorb a lot of nutrients and minerals properly when the ANS is stuck in crisis mode. It really struggles to do a lot of basic absorptions. Low vitamin D perhaps similarly could be explained that way, but also because a lot of POTS patients, I would imagine, are not getting outside. They're stuck at home, they're stuck inside, and therefore they have low vitamin D levels because they don't have access to the sun. So the next thing I want to talk about is Professor Fischer also talked about putative causes or mechanisms that lead to POTS. And one thing that he mentioned, and although I didn't capture it on my phone, but that 2/3 of POTS patients get the condition following an acute trigger, traumatic trigger, i.e., which is very much in line with the limbic system impairment hypothesis, and 1/3 have gradual onset POTS, which I would explain as lots of smaller traumas over a longer period of time, which is more was my case in a way. Now, another thing he pointed out is that there is no typical presentation of POTS. Each person is different, and therefore you need an individualized treatment plan from his point of view for everyone. And I think that's a very worthy point, and something that I would agree with. I think that everyone is different. Everyone comes to it differently. Even if, from my point of view, everyone does end up with limbic system impairment when they have POTS, there's still a whole range of individualized factors that will lead someone there. So in this slide, Professor Fischer was talking about the role of deconditioning. And what his research has found is that deconditioning is identified in 68% of adolescent POTS patients. However, as he put it, although this means that 2/3 of POTS patients in this adolescent cohort that he's looking at are deconditioned, 1/3 of them also are not. They are conditioned. And so that shows that really and truly you can't think of deconditioning as the cause of POTS, because if that were true, then why are 1/3 of them cardiovascularly fit? Which is a very important point. They should all be cardiovascularly unfit if deconditioning in and of itself is the cause of POTS. And he makes that point. He says there on the slide that this is something that might be more consequence than cause, and it is, of course. From the point of view of what I'm trying to say, deconditioning is a secondary factor. It is never a primary factor in causing POTS. If it were, then all of the elderly pretty much would have it. Okay, and they don't. So there you are. So in line with that point, what he also said was that within the group of people, the 1/3 of people who were conditioned, there was actually a number of them who he termed hyperkinetic, by which he meant super conditioned. So there actually some of these teenagers were very, very conditioned, very strong, and this allowed them to overcome a lot of the problems of POTS. in terms of the blood pooling and so on. They had a more efficient cardiovascular system to deal with those problems. But what that shows again is that it's simply not the cause, right? Yes, so this is an interesting slide in talking about the hyperadrenergic type of POTS. Now, of course, I don't kind of separate them out that way. I think that it's a mistake to use subsets in relation to POTS. But anyway, Professor Fischer was talking about the hyperadrenergic subset of POTS, and in particular the role of the stress hormone norepinephrine. And what he said was that norepinephrine has been found to be elevated at rest in POTS patients, and there's a fourfold increase upon standing in POTS patients. This is true. This is absolutely the case. And this, by the way, from my point of view, points to the key to understanding POTS as a whole is that there is so much adrenaline in the POTS patient. And this is a knock-on effect or secondary effect of a limbic system in crisis. Because when a limbic system is in crisis, it sends the signal to the autonomic nervous system to release adrenaline all the time. And this is what is happening in POTS patients. There is a sense of adrenaline going off frequently. This eventually leads, for various reasons, to blood vessel dysfunction, which I talk about in other videos, which can also explain the fourfold increase upon standing. But I won't go into that here. So the next thing which I thought was important from Professor Fischer's talk was the emphasis on non-pharmacological therapy being the better first course of treatment, i.e. not going down the medication route if you can avoid it, a personalised treatment plan with support through a dedicated team for each patient, which I thought was great. He talked about then a kind of exercise protocol that he recommends, and he talked about a 3-week kind of program that they run for teenagers with POTS in the Mayo Clinic, which combines a start of an exercise protocol with cognitive behavioural therapy. And actually the results from this are very, very promising and very encouraging indeed. And Professor Fischer, has this incredible optimism and positivity, which I really appreciated. And he's sort of in a way, I'm not going to say a lone voice, but he's a very positive voice, in terms of believing that it is possible to get better from POTS, whereas a lot of the time the overlying sort of the typical and mantra, as it were, that is given forth is that you cannot get better from POTS. You have it for life, whereas Professor Fischer says actually you can get better. And what he said was, I wrote it down here, that he has a bias that all teenagers can recover potentially, right? And I think this is such a breath of fresh air because it's true, right? It's simply true. And he talked about data which backed these ideas up. So you see in this slide here that there was a study, and this was one that I've mentioned before in a different video, but it's good to have it here, that amongst adolescents and adults with POTS, it was found that 34% of them recovered after 1 year. So 1 year following diagnosis, they had recovered. Okay. Now you might say, okay, well, there's 66% of people who haven't, and that's true. But still, the fact that 34% of people did, and they weren't even following the DNRS, right? The fact that 34% of people did is showing that there are reasons why people are getting better, and this is not random when people do, and it is something you can get better from, right? And another very interesting and helpful study in line with this was this paper, which is not published yet, but is upcoming, and outcomes of adolescent onset postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And just look at that part circled in the red down there, which I'm just zooming in on. And the conclusion of the paper is that 86% of adolescents with POTS report resolved, improved, or just intermittent symptoms when assessed via questionnaire at an average of 5 years after initial treatment. that, is great. Now, it's not telling us from that I can't see how many of those were fully recovered, but nevertheless, it's a positive picture. So the other thing I thought was really positive about Professor Fischer's talk was on this slide here, an approach to patients with functional disorders. This was really important because, so many POTS patients, they're told they're nuts, they're sort of bandied around from one consultant to another, they're regarded as malingering, they're difficult, and of course we know that POTS is very, very serious and devastating illness, and very, very real, and absolutely not something that is being made up. And Professor Fischer was very keen to emphasize this and say that it's really important to validate the patients, really important to say, actually, this is real, you are suffering with something horrible, but then to also give positive recommendations and positive advice that it is possible to get better. So he says things here, validate, your symptoms are miserable. Damn right. Affirm, this is a real problem, it's not in your head. Makes a real difference. Share, what are your goals? Focus, let's go beyond discovery to recovery. Brilliant. Use the science of neural networking. Good. Let's review our specific next steps. Yes, you're not alone, we're in this together. Be optimistic, maximize placebo's power. Spot on again. Care, empathize, humanize, be genuine, and humour goes a long way. What a wonderful set of guidelines for any. I even get goosebumps thinking, why can't this be more the case? What a wonderful set of guidelines for medical professionals in approaching POTS patients. So that was that point, and he talks about the empowering language and the importance of. He actually used the word neuroplasticity at some point as well. So actually really interesting to know what his approach is. But, it was a very good talk. I really enjoyed it. I loved the positivity of it. I really appreciated his warm manner. And I just think that I'm really glad to know that he is the person who is kind of in charge of seeing a lot of adolescent patients with POTS. A really kind of warm and caring and forward-focused and forward-thinking sort of person. And I thought his talk was simply excellent and very encouraging. So I hope you found this interesting, to these reflections on Professor Fischer's talk. And I really look forward to your comments as always, and wish you a pleasant day wherever you are.